The year is 70 AD. The ancient city of Jerusalem, sacred and unyielding, stands encircled by towering stone walls that have resisted countless attacks over centuries. Inside, the city is alive with tension and determination. Jewish rebels, hardened by years of unrest and rebellion, prepare to defend their homes, their families, and their faith against the most powerful army the world has ever known. Every gate is reinforced, every tower manned, every street barricaded. The defenders know that the Romans are patient, methodical, and deadly. But they also know that they fight for something greater than gold or territory. They fight for Jerusalem itself. From the west, the Roman legions approach, a storm of steel and discipline that stretches across the horizon. The army numbers between 50,000 and 70,000 men, a combination of heavy Roman infantry, seasoned auxiliaries, local allies, and hired mercenaries. This is the empire at the height of its power, vast and unrelenting, with the resources to starve, batter, and conquer the city if necessary. Emperor Vespasian, wise and cunning, has entrusted the campaign to his son, Titus Flavius. Barely in his 30s, Titus is already a veteran commander, seasoned by years of campaigns in Galilee and the Jordan Valley. He rides at the head of his legions, a figure of authority and calm in the midst of the gathering storm. His presence a beacon for both his troops and the rebels, who watch from the walls. Titus wastes no time in preparing for the siege. He orders the construction of fortified camps and positions his legions strategically. The 12th, 15th, and 5th legions take the western front, while the 10th establishes itself on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the northern approaches. Roman siege engines, immense and terrifying, are brought into position. Towering siege hours capable of reaching the ramparts, battering rams to smash through gates, and catapults to hurl projectiles into the city. These engines are not only weapons but symbols of Roman might, intended to instill fear and break the resolve of those within the walls. Yet Jerusalem is not a city to be intimidated. The rebels, aware of the formidable power arrayed against them, respond with equal determination. Rival factions of Jewish fighters put aside old grievances and unite in the face of a common threat. They patrol the walls, sharpen their weapons, and reinforce their positions. The streets and alleys become a network of defensive choke points, ready for the day when Rome's siege engines finally advance. The defenders know that they are outnumbered, yet their cause imbues them with courage, and every soldier is determined to fight to the last dot before fully committing to the siege. Titus leads a reconnaissance mission with 600 cavalrymen to assess the city's northern defenses. It is a perilous endeavor. Rebel forces ambush the small Roman contingent, cutting off escape routes and forcing Titus to maneuver with both caution and skill. His leadership ensures that the reconnaissance succeeds, and he returns to the main army to plan the attack with precision. Once on the western front, he supervises the construction of camps and siege works, ensuring that each legion is in position and prepared for the coming engagement. But the rebels are not idle. Seizing a moment of vulnerability, they launch a surprise attack on the 10th Legion stationed near the Mount of Olives. Across the Kidron Valley, they charge with ferocity, raining projectiles on the unprepared Roman soldiers. The 10th Legion, fatigued from their march and caught off guard, struggles to form defensive lines. The front sections falter, and for a moment, it seems the city's defenders might break through. Momentum and morale are firmly on the side of the rebels, emboldened by their knowledge that they fight to defend their sacred homeland. Word of the ambush reaches Titus. Without hesitation, he rallies several hundred of his heavy cavalry and rides to the 10th Legion's aid. His timely arrival stabilizes the lines and demonstrates the critical advantage of Roman discipline and coordination. The cavalry strikes the attackers, pushing back the rebels and giving the legionaries a chance to regroup. Despite the initial shock, the Romans' training and experience begin to turn the tide. Discipline, leadership, and courage gradually counter the rebels' momentum, transforming a dangerous skirmish into a controlled engagement. As the sun climbs higher, both sides brace for the long struggle ahead. Jerusalem is strong, but Rome is patient. The city will not fall easily, nor will the Romans relent. The stage is set for a siege that will test the limits of courage, strategy, and endurance. The first clash has already demonstrated that this will be a battle defined not just by the weapons of men, but by their resolve, their faith, and the unyielding will to either defend or conquer the ancient city. Titus arrived at the northern front just in time, his heavy cavalry crashing into the exposed flank of the Jewish rebels. The thunder of hooves and the flash of polished armor sent shockwaves through the enemy lines, driving many back toward the gates. Yet the rebels did not yield. Instead, they regrouped, their determination as fierce as ever. They launched counterattacks with renewed vigor, arrows streaking through the air and stones crashing down upon the Roman lines. The soldiers of the 10th Legion, already exhausted from the initial skirmish, felt the weight of the unyielding assault. Some began to falter, their morale shaken, contemplating whether retreat might be the only option to survive this relentless onslaught. But though sight of Titus, steadfast and unflinching amidst the chaos, inspired them to steel themselves. Here was a general who had stood his ground, fighting alongside his men and never yielding to fear or hesitation. Ashamed of their momentary lapse, the soldiers of the 10th Legion regrouped, shields interlocked, spears leveled, and a renewed sense of discipline surged through the ranks. With coordinated precision, they pressed forward, pushing the Jewish attackers back toward the safety of the city walls. The rebels, despite their courage, were momentarily repelled by the Romans' cohesion and the sheer authority of their commander. Understanding that his forces needed to maintain momentum and that the rebels could not be allowed to regroup, Titus sent additional troops to the eastern side of the Jerusalem wall. This strategic reinforcement was intended to discourage further sallies, ensuring that the Jewish defenders could not exploit gaps or weak points. With the flank secure, Titus turned his attention to the western gate, where the bulk of his army awaited, including his 3 main legions. Siege equipment, carefully constructed and meticulously maintained, was brought into position. Massive catapults hurled stones at the walls, while Scorpion ballistae fired projectiles overhead, providing cover for the advancing infantry. The thunder of engines and the clash of projectiles set a grim symphony of war across the battlefield. The legions advanced in tightly formed testudos, shields overlapping to create nearly impenetrable walls of iron and wood. Battering rams, engineered to focus their full force on specific sections of the stone walls, smashed repeatedly, each strike sending vibrations through the ground and reverberating across the city. The defenders fought with desperation, hurling fire, arrows, and stones down upon the Roman troops. For 15 long days, the defenders repelled every attempt to breach the walls. their resilience and knowledge of the terrain making every inch a bloody struggle. The battering rams, however, were relentless. Protected by the Romans' disciplined formations and advancing siege towers, they finally began to wear down the massive stones of the western walls. Once the breach was achieved, Roman soldiers poured into the city, advancing through the gaps and climbing the walls with the aid of siege towers. Their disciplined formations allowed them to move efficiently and effectively, cutting down any who dared stand against them. The Jewish defenders, unable to muster enough manpower to counter the assault, retreated toward the inner sections of Jerusalem, seeking the relative safety of the second set of walls. The Romans, sensing their advantage, pushed forward without hesitation, ensuring that momentum stayed firmly on their side. Yet the fight within the inner walls was far from easy. Narrow streets and tight alleys became death traps for the advancing legions. Jewish skirmishers, slingers, and small groups of determined fighters used the confined spaces to their advantage, picking off soldiers one by one and inflicting serious losses. Roman progress stalled in some areas, forcing Titus to adapt. He sent forward Roman archers to counter the skirmishers, methodically clearing paths and securing critical positions. With the threat neutralized, siege works were brought forward again. The breaches widened, and Roman troops began to reclaim entire sections of the inner city, recognizing the importance of psychological warfare, as well as physical dominance. Titus ordered the destruction of the northern section of Jerusalem. Buildings were set ablaze, barricades torn down, and smoke filled the sky, signaling to the defenders that resistance was increasingly futile. During these days of assault and destruction, civilians, primarily unarmed, sought escape, abandoning homes and possessions in an effort to survive. The city's population began to fracture under the relentless pressure, a mix of fear, exhaustion, and pragmatism driving them to flee wherever they could. By this stage, Titus had established a pattern of relentless pressure combined with calculated restraint. His legions were allowed periods of rest to recover from the exhausting labor of siege. Yet the threat of renewed Roman attacks hung over the city like a specter. Each breach, each advance, demonstrated the deadly efficiency of Roman discipline and strategy. Despite the courage and ingenuity of the Jewish defenders, it became increasingly clear that their resources were dwindling, their positions were vulnerable, and the sheer organizational might of Rome, guided by a commander like Titus, was overwhelming. The Jewish defenders, however, were stubborn beyond measure. Even as the Romans gained control of the entire northern section of Jerusalem, they refused to abandon their positions. Titus, realizing the importance of consolidating his forces and maintaining momentum, pulled his legions back from the captured areas to regroup. He combined his troops with the 10th Legion and the other units stationed on the Eastern Front, forming a unified force capable of striking with overwhelming precision. Yet, Titus knew the battle would not be won by brute force alone. Jerusalem's defenders were fiercely motivated, willing to fight to the death for their homes, their families, and their faith. Reports from the city suggested that the Jewish factions, while united temporarily against the common Roman threat, were rife with internal divisions. Rival groups from Judea, Galilee, and the Zealots vied for overall control, leading to infighting that weakened their long-term defensive strategy. For a brief time, however, these bitter divisions were set aside, under the shadow of the approaching Roman legions. the factions coalesced, combining their manpower and resources to resist the imperial onslaught. Even with this temporary unity, they remained wary of surrender. Titus had extended the offer once again for a peaceful resolution, but the defenders feared humiliation, torture, or crucifixion at the hands of the Romans, and so they refused. The next phase of the siege saw Titus adopt a methodical, strategic approach. At the Antonia fortress, he began constructing massive siege ramps made of earth and rock. These ramps allowed the Romans to advance siege engines closer to the fortress walls, while providing cover for the infantry. But the Jews, demonstrating their cunning and ingenuity, fought fiercely to prevent the Romans from gaining a foothold. They brought forward artillery previously captured from Roman campaigns, ballistae, catapults, and other war machines, unleashed a torrent of missiles on the approaching Roman forces. Every strike threatened to undo days of labor and kill countless soldiers, adding to the Romans' challenges. The Jewish defenders sent sapper teams of skilled diggers to undermine the newly built ramps. The tunnels were set aflame just as the siege engines approached, causing the wooden supports to collapse. Tons of soil and rock came crashing down, burying Roman siege engines and temporarily halting the assault. Titus, whose patience was being tested by days of failed attacks, realized that brute force alone would not succeed. He decided on a more comprehensive strategy, the construction of a circumvallation wall encircling the city 5 miles around, cutting off Jerusalem from all supplies and reinforcements. Within 3 days, Roman engineers built the massive fortification, complete with defensive towers every few hundred meters. The message was unmistakable: no one would enter or leave Jerusalem. Unchallenged as famine and desperation began to take hold within the city, Titus identified the moment to strike again. The legions returned to the Antonia fortress. Fortuitously, the previous tunnel excavations had left the structure weakened. Thousands of armored soldiers advancing, coupled with the immense weight of the fortress stones, caused parts of the wall to collapse. Roman soldiers poured into the fortress, breaching the inner defenses. Titus ordered the destruction of the Antonia fortress itself. Yet the Jewish defenders, determined to resist to the very last, regrouped behind a second wall outside the temple complex. The Romans, undeterred, pressed forward, attempting to breach this final defensive line. The defenders fought fiercely, and after a 12-hour battle, the Romans were held at bay temporarily. Jewish skirmishers seized the moment to attempt to break out, but Roman discipline and firepower quickly repelled them, forcing a retreat back into the inner city. Recognizing that time and attrition were now on his side, Titus ordered a full encirclement of the city. He commanded the construction of multiple siege ramps targeting the temple's fortifications. Days of pounding battering rams finally forced the defenders to retreat into the temple's inner court. Josephus, the Jewish captive, an historian accompanying Titus, recorded that the general convened his commanders to debate the temple's fate. Some urged immediate destruction, but Titus, admiring the magnificence of the structure, initially sought to preserve it as a monument to Roman supremacy. Fate, however, intervened. Raging fires ignited by the ongoing combat spread uncontrollably, engulfing the temple. The sacred halls, the sanctuaries, and the courts went up in smoke, leaving the defenders paralyzed by shock and despair. Panic swept through the Jewish ranks. Rebels attempted escape through sewers, alleys, and over the remaining walls. Some sought to negotiate with Titus, hoping for mercy or reprieve. But the Roman general, recognizing that leniency would prolong resistance and cost more lives, dismissed all talks of surrender. "No terms shall be granted," he declared. His soldiers, exhilarated by victory in months of grueling siege warfare, cheered, proclaiming him imperator across the city. The legions advanced relentlessly, plundering homes, slaughtering those who resisted, and asserting Roman dominance in every street and alley. In early September of 70 AD, after months of siege, Jerusalem was fully subdued. The northern and inner sections were leveled, the temple destroyed, and vast portions of the city reduced to rubble. Josephus would later write that the destruction was so thorough that former residents could not recognize their own city. Streets, markets, and homes vanished. Centuries of history and culture were erased in weeks of relentless warfare. The human cost was staggering, with casualties so vast that no precise record could be kept. Those who survived faced captivity, enslavement, or exile, their lives forever altered by the catastrophic defeat. The siege of Jerusalem was more than a military conquest. It was a statement of imperial power, an unflinching demonstration of Rome's ability to suppress rebellion, and a chilling testament to the consequences of defiance against the might of the empire. Titus, through strategy, discipline, and determination, had achieved victory where many believed it impossible. The city was lost, the temple lay in ruins, and the Jewish resistance was crushed, marking the end of one of the most dramatic and pivotal sieges in ancient history.